Thank you all for coming. Appreciate you coming out for our second lecture of the series. This series, we are featuring newer faculty at UW-Whitewater. We've had a number of different faculty come on board in the past few years. Their first few years on campus were pandemic related, so we really wanted an opportunity to get out in the community and talk with everybody. So we have a wide range of topics this semester, and I hope you'll be able to join us for many of them. So I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we have hosted the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services since 1983. So this fall we'll be celebrating 40 years here, so it's great to be here. Yes, and so let's go ahead and get started with today's presenter. Olivia McLaughlin is an assistant professor of sociology and criminology at UW-Whitewater. Within sociology, Olivia explores racism and anti-racism in U.S. feminism and the ways in which whiteness intersects with womanhood. Her upcoming co-authored book, The Black Feminist Coup: Black Women's Lived Experiences in White Supremacist Feminist Academic Spaces, examines the unique role white academic women play in harming the women of color they work with. In her other area, criminology, Olivia explores state and state corporate crime. At UW-Whitewater, Olivia teaches social problems, introduction to criminology, principles of sociology, and corporate and governmental deviance. In her free time, she enjoys listening to audiobooks with her 4 cats, taking care of plants, and doing jigsaw puzzles. Please welcome Olivia McLaughlin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's so nice to talk about sociology with people outside of a classroom. I don't have to manipulate folks to come by scheduling a quiz or an exam. I can just talk about sociology. So I am going to use this thing. Yes, there we go. I am a visual person, so I like to have a roadmap. It helps me stay focused in presentations. So I want to give you a roadmap. I'm going to start by explaining what intersectional feminism is. The talk that I'm going to give is on race, white privilege, and feminism. The study itself looks at intersectionality. So talk about that for a second. I also want to explain why I study this, because it's pretty central to the study that I'm going to share with you today. So I'll tell you a little bit about that, talk about our findings, and there are some handouts around there. I didn't know how many to bring. I hope that we have enough, but I'm going to pick your all's brain about the data I collected, and I want to talk a little bit about your thoughts of what folks shared with me, and then hopefully come to some meaningful conclusion at the end of it. So I have an idea of where we are, I'm first curious, how many of us have heard of intersectionality or intersectional feminism? Okay, perfect. This is good, because that means that the 5 minutes I planned in for this won't be to waste. So it's probably, the first place to start is probably just with the recognition that feminists don't agree on a lot. Some feminists believe that sexism and patriarchy is the root of women's oppression. Other feminists say, actually, it's class inequality, and we need to be focused on poverty and socioeconomic status. And then there's still other feminists who say, well, everybody's wrong. We need to be looking at race and class and gender at the same time. And this is the probably easiest way to explain intersectional feminism. And while I could spend an entire semester talking about it, I think we can sum it up pretty easily with just 3 points. The first thing that intersectional feminists say and believe is that we are more than just a single identity. We are not just women or men or white people and people of color. We are many things at once. And so there is a desire to acknowledge those intersecting identities. That's where the term comes from, intersectionality. In part, intersectional feminism is a critique of what's known as white feminism, which is the idea that gender is the only identity that matters for women. Intersectional feminism say sexism alone isn't important. It is sexism as it interacts with all of these other systems of power. So intersectional feminists push back on this idea and ask feminists to consider the various systems of power that are at work in society. They say that there are differences among women. All women are not equal. And rather than shy away from discussion of difference, we should lean into that. We should acknowledge difference. We are differently privileged and disadvantaged by things like class and ability status and citizenship. And these are things that are worth considering in women's movements. Particularly, the focus is on women of color. Intersectional feminism is born out of Black women's theorizing and activism. So there's a particular focus on the experience of Black women and how that is unique and not comparable to the experience of white women. The second tenet of intersectional feminism is, in addition to the idea that we need to recognize we all have multiple identities, we also need to recognize that we can't focus on sexism alone in a women's movement. It's the idea that to the extent that Black people are oppressed, so too are women, because there are people who are both Black and also women. It comes from this idea that none of us are free until all of us are free. So because some of us are oppressed by multiple systems at once, a feminism that does not acknowledge how those systems of power are connected is not going to be a productive women's movement. For example, if we think about some gender norms that harm women, the idea that women are submissive or that women are overly emotional and meek. These are not just gender norms, these are raced gender norms. Research shows that Black women are not free to express emotions in the same way that white women are. Black women are expected to be strong, and they are not expected to show emotion. They are assumed to be sometimes aggressive and loud. Those are not the same assumptions we make about white women. So gender norms exist, and they are raced, and they are classed, and they are culture-specific and time-specific. So it's really, again, intersectional feminism is the request that we are acknowledging multiple systems of power at once. The third tenet of intersectional feminism is more a practical one. It is kind of an action-based assertion. It argues that the most effective way to achieve women's liberation is by centering the most marginalized among us. The idea being, if we can solve a very, very complex problem, everyone else will necessarily benefit. By centering poor Black women or poor women of color, poor immigrant women, white women, privileged women, wealthy women will necessarily benefit from that. If we can improve the condition of the most marginalized, everyone comes out on top. So that was a whirlwind, but those are the three things that I'm going to keep coming back to when I look at the data. But before going on to the research itself, I think it's helpful to tell you a little bit about why I study this. This is me as a baby feminist in my undergrad at a women's center event. So I majored in women's and gender studies. And like many women, white women, I realized I was a feminist in college. I was always very angry and frustrated in my conservative town. And then I got to college and I found the language to describe like why I was frustrated. But essentially why I'm telling you all this is because my understanding of feminism was very impacted by what I learned in the classroom. And in the classroom, I learned that the history of women's movements they progressed in a linear fashion. We started off with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they were super racist, and that sucked. But hey, they were a product of their time. Then we got to the 60s and 70s, and the women were still pretty racist. But hey, it was the 60s and 70s, and the civil rights movement just ended, so we can't really hold them accountable. It was a very reductive, simplistic, whitewashed version of the history of women's movements. I learned that as feminism progressed, each stage we became more progressive, less racist, more focused, and better organized. And it wasn't until I left my little liberal arts bubble, found a community, started working in that community and organizing in that community that I realized that was a lie. That's not how history progresses. It's not so simplistic. It's not so linear. So I started to see that this version of feminism, this retelling, it wasn't true. Black women, women of color, women that I worked with and loved and am friends with, they continued to feel marginalized in feminist spaces. The white women that I lived with and worked with continued to exercise power over women of color in feminist spaces. And they didn't want to, quote, make it about race. They didn't want to talk about difference in women's movements. They found it divisive, and they found it to be a conflict, and people are uncomfortable with conflict. A lot of the white women in feminism that I interacted with didn't see race as relevant in the context of feminism. And I remember thinking, why does everyone think that feminism became intersectional in the 80s and 90s? This clearly hasn't happened. This is not the reality. I started feeling like I was lied to, and so I wanted to do my own research, and I was in grad school, and I needed something to research. So I went out to design my own study and came up with these 3 questions. The first thing I wanted to know is, what do white feminists believe? We didn't actually have a ton of research on this. A lot of the research we had was theoretical, or in the humanities, there wasn't a lot of empirical evidence of like, okay, this is what U.S. feminists believe. I also wanted to know how their racial identity interacted with their gender identity to influence their beliefs about gender oppression. I wanted to know what they thought about intersectionality, and if it was part of their feminism, what that meant to them. And then I also wanted to know what white feminists thought about the role of race, racism, and anti-racism in feminism. So these are the 3 questions that I went into this project with. That's a little bit redundant. So I came up with this fancy term. It's a 3-part mixed sequential design. Doesn't that sound very fancy? It was really important to me that this study depart from the standpoint of Black women, because intersectional feminism is Black feminism. And so I wanted to start from their standpoint. So I sent out a survey first. It was a purposive sample, meaning I purposefully sought out Black women to take the survey, and I asked them 2 questions. The first, if you could say anything to white feminists, what would it be? And the second, I'm going to talk to white feminists about race and feminism. What do you want me to ask? I analyzed those results, and I came up with an interview guide, and I spoke to 23 white feminists. Once I did that, again, because this was born out of my experience in community, it was important to me that it didn't stop at the research. So after speaking to the white feminists, I invited them back for a focus group discussion where I told them not only how I analyzed the interviews, what I found, but I also shared with them the survey results from the Black women in the first part of the data collection. Most of what I'm talking about today comes from the interviews, but some of the findings come from the focus group. So what did I find? I found that a little under half of the participants I talked to knew what intersectional feminism was and identified with it. We're going to complicate that just a little bit. The second thing I found was that the vast majority, in fact, all but one participant, spoke about race, their racial identity, in the context of feminism, which was surprising to me. I expected a lot fewer, I guess. And then the third thing that I found was that participants had very complicated ideas about the relationship between race and anti-racism in feminism. And so I think my plan for this is to take these in turn, and I do what I think is the easiest one first, which is participants' understanding of intersectional feminism. Go over their ideas about race, but that's where it gets really hard to make sense of things. So we'll start easy. Okay. So it was a little under half, 11 out of 23, had understood intersectionality and identified with it. This was a big, what was very compelling to participants about intersectionality was that first tenet that we went over, the idea that you can have multiple identities at once, and that those combined to give everybody a unique experience with oppression. In this way, intersectional feminism was a frame for them. It helped them make sense of how they could be both privileged and oppressed. Most participants' understanding of intersectional feminism stopped here. It was a way that they could take stock of their identities. So here's a couple examples. I asked Nicole, and these are all pseudonyms, what does it mean to be an intersectional feminist, after she had said that she knew what it was. And she said, you look at race, class, gender, if you're disabled or able-bodied, your gender identity, your sexuality, they all intersect. Pretty similar from Bob. I'm not queer or non-binary or a woman or white or poor. I am all of those things at once. And another very similar one from Sadie, but Sadie integrates power into her response. She says, there's the intersectionality of all my privileges. How do all of those things intersect to give you a higher position on the rung? So she is thinking about this in terms of power in society. This was how all participants understood intersectional feminism. It was very helpful and compelling for them in this way. When we get into thinking about how that applies to their ideas about sexism and gender oppression, it gets a little more complicated. So I wonder if you could take a look at your handouts under the first section. Should say something about like participants on white or racial identity or something of the sort. Maybe just take a look through those, and I'm curious what you all see. What stands out? Yes, what stands out? In other words, like, what are they talking about? Do you see any patterns? I'm asking them here about their race and if they see their race as important in the context of feminism. I do this mostly so I have time to take a drink of water. Does anything stand out? Anybody notice any patterns? Okay, yes.
They're the ones that are going to give this, all of whatever.
Yes. Yes, Lily and Allie, I believe. They're talking about privilege as something to maybe dismantle or give up. Yeah.
Like it's our job, or it's our, we don't want to willingly do it, but we know in order to get this thing ironed out, we have to.
Something's got to give. Yeah. Other themes that you all picked out or noticed?
It was strictly taken for granted.
Oh, okay. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, that's just the way it came over to me, that, well, yes, because of the color of my skin and all of these, we don't even think about anything else impacted.
Yeah.
And so, well, this isn't such a big deal.
Oh, I see. Like taken for granted.
It seems like they have an assumption about themselves, the white women, and they are in a position of hierarchy and need to give chances to people of color, so to speak. And then there's a certain, I shouldn't say arrogance, but
Condescension.
I'm sorry.
Condescension.
Condescension, yes, exactly. That was
Yeah. Was there a particular excerpt that stood out to you?
Lend a helping hand.
Oh, okay. Does that represent?
Well, my neighbor here mentioned, it's up to us
Ah. Okay. Yeah. Lending a helping hand.
to like, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. In the nice salmon-colored blouse.
It makes us more powerful.
I don't see any indication that they expect to learn anything from the others.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, interesting. See, I told Carrie that I was doing this mostly to see if you guys could see something that I missed. And yeah, this is good for me. So you got the sense that they're not going in expecting to be told anything different or learn anything new.
Power. The white women have power to do something better for the black women.
Okay, yes. Any other thoughts?
Did you explain when someone talks, because we can't hear?
Oh, yes, definitely. Thank you. Up here, they were saying that it's very clear that the white women have the power. And then I think putting all of these together, it's the idea that the white women are in a position to help and lend a helping hand, and maybe going in with a little bit of hubris. These are things that I picked up on as well, although maybe not in exactly the same way. But the white privilege component that I think everyone's getting at, this component of helping, really, really stood out to me. Only some of the excerpts are on here. I have some others up here. Kelsey talks about using white privilege to, quote, give voice to. Madeline talks about the need to make them feel welcome, to create space. And I found this very interesting. This is very different from, for instance, what Lily and Allie say. Lily and Allie are not interested in having privilege, and in fact, they talk about wanting to dismantle it. They do not believe that privilege can be used for good. They have no interest in, even with good intentions, using it under the auspice of improvement or progression. For them, it is not a good thing. But for Kelsey, Nicole, Madeline, Cleo, Ellen, Joanna, Nina, Danielle, Sadie, and Stella, they believe that privilege can be a good thing. They see it as something they can use to help people. And this stuck out to me for a few reasons. The first is because they're speaking about privilege in very abstract, almost hypothetical terms. So this is when participants would say, oh, I use my white privilege, I would ask, tell me how. How do you use your white privilege? And in response, we get kind of abstract, vague descriptions. I believe it's Joanna or maybe Ellen. I get my pseudonyms mixed up. Someone talks about the kind of like a ripple metaphor. The longer quote is, she explains, it's like a drop in the water. You drop a pebble in the water and you don't know where that ripple's gonna go. It goes out and you don't have control over it. Very vague, very abstract, doesn't feel very purposeful. And then I think Madeline talks about passing off the microphone at this hypothetical scenario where she's at a conference on wage inequality. And then another who's at a roundtable discussion on anti-racism. And so I would ask them, do you ever go to roundtable discussions on anti-racism? And of course they don't. So it's very kind of out there and removed from them. The other thing that stood out for me is this helping discourse, which a lot of you picked up on. The helping discourse was very important because in whiteness studies, it's called white saviorism. This idea that white people should be involved in anti-racism because we're good Samaritans, not because we recognize we have a vested interest in anti-racism, not because we recognize that we are responsible for racism, but the idea that you should do it because it's the right thing. We should help each other. As someone that researches feminism, this was really, really important because it shows me that they think of race and racism as something that exists out there, as something that they're not impacted by. And remember, one of the tenets of intersectional feminism is that we are all impacted by one another's oppression, that we all have a vested interest in dismantling racism, for none of us are free until all of us are free. So long as one woman is oppressed, all women are under threat. So for the participants that I spoke to, or at least the majority of them, the motivation to be anti-racist was not with an understanding that it was to their benefit as well. It was for the desire of helping. And whiteness scholars say that this is potentially a tactic to maybe assuage white guilt or engage in racism in kind of a safe, or anti-racism rather, to engage in anti-racism in kind of a gentle or safe way, in a way that doesn't actually require someone to recognize the harm, and instead to think about racism in productive or in good terms, like, racism is the root of privilege, but it can be good, it can be productive, rather than recognizing the harm of it. I think there is another section under there. It's some excerpts in response to questions I asked participants about the relationship between anti-racism and feminism. And if you'd like to take a look at those, I'd be interested in hearing what you think about that as well. Anything stick out? Abso-freaking-lutely. Yes.
Everybody We want everybody to come aboard feeling like they are an equal participant.
Okay, yeah. So you get the sense that people are wanting folks to feel included.
Yes.
Okay.
And then also not labeling people.
Yeah, not labeling people. Any particular reason that stood out to you?
Well, it's just, I mean, I find that I have labeled people in the past. I try not to do that because it's ineffective.
Okay.
Yeah.
The question of identities, do we acknowledge them? Do we label people? Do we take stock of those? That's something that these participants are definitely struggling with, at least a couple of them. Anything else stand out? Yes.
They seem to want to separate racism and feminism.
Yeah. Why does that stand out to you?
Well, it seemed like several of them mentioned that, and like if I'm white, I just want to talk about the women's part, what's affecting me seemingly, so
Yeah.
racism somewhere else.
So I'm used to knowing people's names when I'm in this setting. What is your name? Deb. So what Deb is saying is that some of the participants seem to be saying we want to keep things separate, and potentially it could be maybe a selfish desire. If you're white, you probably don't want to have to be confronted with racism in a women's movement, maybe. Anything else that stand out maybe we want to point out? These are things that stood out to me as well. I especially got a kick of a couple of the participants who said, I'm an intersectional feminist, but I see racism and feminism as separate. This is the title of the presentation. I'm an intersectional feminist, but I'm not. I started referring to these participants as separate but equal participants. This, of course, is derived from the landmark 1896 Supreme Court ruling from the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. This was the Supreme Court ruling that affirmed the 14th Amendment, that discrimination is unlawful, but said segregation is not necessarily discrimination. So we can continue to segregate and not discriminate. This is why I call them separate but equal. So they stipulated that segregation, or rather the 14th Amendment, is not necessarily written to prevent discrimination. That's not the point. This is what the Supremes say. And this is what provided states with that tacit approval they needed to roll out Jim Crow segregation laws and policies that would exclude Black people from spaces. So while racial discrimination was not outwardly or technically legal, it was sanctioned. They kind of turned the cheek to it, so to say. Similarly, these participants agreed that people of color should be treated equally. All of these participants in front of you on this sheet identified as anti-racist. They said, I believe people of color should be treated equally. They do not overtly ask for segregation in women's movements. They're not saying we don't want Black women and women of color in our feminism, just as Plessy does not overtly encourage discrimination. However, by virtue of maintaining separate spaces between racial justice and feminism, they're effectively ensuring that women of color are not going to be supported by feminists in a way that's going to meaningfully improve their condition. They're advocating for women of color to have a voice, right? In those previous slides, we want to uplift them, we want to give them voice, but they're stipulating that that should only happen if women of color are willing to prioritize white women. This was an upsetting finding for me. Not only because this is my community, I'm talking to people in my community. So it's upsetting to me as an intersectional feminist, but it's also upsetting as an intersectionality researcher, because this was a little bit of the finding for me that said, yeah, textbooks are not always right. The textbooks I read in college were not always right. It was evidence that at least some of us believe that whiteness should be supreme in feminist spaces. Because Black women don't experience gender-only issues, when feminists advocate for keeping race out of feminism, they're advocating for a feminism that prioritizes white women's problems. These are participants that said that race was important, that anti-racism was important to them, that racism was wrong. They believed that racism was a social problem, that it needed to be addressed. They wanted women of color to be a part of feminism, and they believed it was their job to help women of color feel welcome in feminism, as if women of color hadn't been doing feminism for centuries already. But at the end of the day, they didn't think that discussions about race or racism were important in a feminist context. Kelsey says, I think they should be viewed as separate things. Madeline, it's its own thing, for sure. We need to be aware of intersectionality, but it's its own thing. We need to deal with that, meaning racism, but as a separate issue. And Rita is the only participant I spoke to who actually became really frustrated by my questions. And I ended up having to wrap this part of the interview up pretty quickly. She was very flustered when I asked her about the relationship between race and feminism, and she said, when we're talking about the definition of feminism, if we're adding race into that, that's just not right. We're talking about two things that don't belong together. And a couple times she said, can you explain the question again? She couldn't wrap her head around why I was asking her questions about race in an interview that was supposed to be about women's issues. She said, the actual definition isn't about race. It's just not what feminism is about. And then Lee, who just pretty blatantly said, the things that women of color deal with are not, from what I see, feminism. So what does this mean? Intersectionality was compelling for participants, which is good, right? They're not rejecting it whole cloth. They are willing to consider it, and they find value in parts of it, right? And it helps them make sense of their identities. But it wasn't integrated into their ideas about sexism and oppression, the condition of women, the relationship of women to other women, the bound fates of women. They didn't quite get to that point. They didn't see the situation of white women as related to the oppression of any other women, and they believed it was possible to deal with sexism and racism as separate issues, despite the fact that some women experience sexism and racism at the same time. In this way, the feminists I spoke to were race aware, which is great. It was more than I was expecting. They rejected racism, advocated for anti-racism, and they were knowledgeable about white privilege. That challenged some existing research, which said that whites were not interested in talking about privilege. I didn't find that. That was not the case. For most of the participants that spoke about white privilege, they brought it up on their own. But they didn't integrate the concept of privilege into their feminism. And so they maintained an idea of feminism that ensured that they would remain privileged in their feminist spaces. So it's kind of, there's good and bad to it. It doesn't seem to be true that feminists aren't concerned with race. Feminists do seem to be concerned with race. They don't see it as related to sexism, but the awareness is there. I don't know that that is enough to let me go to bed feeling like we've done a good job. I think there's a lot of work to do, and some of the findings were a little bit upsetting. Yeah, looks like I already talked through all these, so thank you.
Professor McLaughlin will be here for a little bit if you'd like to ask her any questions, but please join me in thanking Professor Olivia McLaughlin. Thank you all for coming.